the second stage of our work on the banking industry. We launched the discussion back in last September at Magdalen College, Cambridge. The unanimous feeling amongst all the bankers that we talked to, and we talked to them in complete confidence, they're never quoted, the unanimous feeling was of an embrace of serious root and branch reform. Not one of them, and I try to sometimes goad them into saying, is this all wrong, is it going too far? Not one of them thought that.
As time passes, I think what happened in the crisis gets simpler, as is often the case. And really what happened, I think, was that banks forgot their business models, forgot what the business model of a bank should be, what their purpose in life should be as a corporate entity. Is we do need to do our job for the economy. And this is a big cultural change that's taken place in the banking sector. I think banks for a number of years, like many other businesses, were saying, we're in it for shareholders, that's all that counts, shareholder value. I do think the banks comprehensively lost their way in customer attitudes over a period of time. You could argue about whether it was 10 years or 20 years, but it certainly happened, and customers were looked at as people to make money out of, rather than people to deliver a service to. We have to be different. We have to behave differently. We have to realise we're part of communities and societies. We have to support SME lending if that's what the economy needs. In the end, banks reflect economies. They tend not to drive economies, but they reflect economies. The economy is successful, the banks are successful. So I think there's a big attitude change taking place. Whether or not those issues should be toughened by further legislation, I think, is an interesting question. My view on this is that banks will repair their reputation by doing the right thing. They won't repair it by PR. PR, you know, or advertising, whatever it is, will play a part. But if you haven't got yourself fixed, if you haven't got yourself sorted out as an industry and the individual organisations, then it's spitting against the wind.
I think that to grow balance sheets so rapidly over such a short period of time, with so little kind of equity underpinning it, you simply have to say that bank managements and shareholders in banks actually made a monumental mistake over their business model. And they made a monumental mistake over their business model, in my view, because that was part of an intellectual mistake that actually self-organising actors in self-organising free markets with maximal amounts of information basically didn't make mistakes.
I don't see the history of the past 10 or 20 years as unfettered market forces being allowed to let rip. I think what we saw was a weird mix of market forces and massive government intervention which rigged these markets.
And actually the reason why democracy and capitalism go hand in hand is you do need public agency, and public agency has to be accountable, hence democracy.
And I think the most important reform has to be macroeconomic reform, which we've not had. We've basically had no change whatsoever there. You're still having central banks who think they're the masters of the universe and who can pump prime economies and so on. I think that's terrible. I
can't imagine that actually that in a democracy you could ever permit savers their deposits to be at risk from mistakes of which actually they cannot expect to have any kind of corrective mechanism. And that demands actually a regulatory response. That demands actually that, you know, that actually there is a dialogue at the very least between the banking sector and, you know, public authorities.
People shouldn't be bailed out, and no one should think they can ever be bailed out. And I think that's a fundamental point. You need to return the discipline of capitalism to capitalism. If you don't have capitalism banking, you have massively distorted outcomes, and you have taxpayers bailing people out.
Why do we still have this bonus structure? Why not a company-wide profit share? Why are bonuses paid when the bank overall makes a loss? The fact that bonuses are linked to the performance of individual divisions and can be paid when the bank is making a loss as a whole is another factor that alienates the public.
According to this poll, 69% say they want to see capping of bonuses and pay. And you know what? Actually, the bonus cap is coming in. I agree the industry didn't like it, the government didn't like it, but the bonus cap at EU level is coming in.
We are not a Me Too. We have an oligopoly of Me Toos. We do not need more Me Toos in this industry. What we need is competition. What we need is to give customers choice so they can make their own decisions about where they want to put their money.
Well, the worry is, with bonuses, with very large remuneration packages, what you're doing is you're displacing the extrinsic motivations because I care about it. Rather the intrinsic motivations, you're replacing it with an extrinsic motivation so that really the reason I'm doing this is because it's in my interest.
And I think there is, 5 years on from the crisis, bafflement that in the outside world's opinion, so little has been done, notwithstanding what Anthony said about the levels of pay, even if more of the pay is deferred and subject to clawback and so on.
Banking's an industry that's just shot through with trust relationships. So the banks facing clients and also facing society. And the moment you have those kind of fiduciary relationships, it's really important that there's transparency about what the motivation is that people are seeking after. And the worry is, if people are seeking after money, if that's the first thing, the moment the incentives get out of line, and at some point they will, that's the point when the trust breaks down.
I think the industry, though, needs to take a long, hard look at itself still. We're being hit by the trust issues too much, the LIBOR, the hedging, the things like that. We just need to flush them out, because we can't move on while these things keep coming out. And it damages the whole industry, and it damages our competitive position, because while those things keep coming out, you can't have a balanced discussion, which means we'll always be pushed too far.
Floating voters are much less interested in policy, let alone ideology, than all of us. I mean, they're what political scientists call valence voters. That is, they tend to make up their mind at election time, not on policies, but on character. Is this leader competent? Is this party on my side? Will they keep their promises? Will they stand firm when the going gets tough? It's those kinds of character judgments. And that's really actually why Margaret Thatcher won 3 elections in a row. It was partly on populist policies like rights to buy, but it was because, those of you who were around 30 years ago will remember, it was, by golly, I may not agree with her, but she knows where she's heading. She knows what she stands for.
So Thatcher, I think, the attitudes of Britain have moved on so much from the Thatcher era that the word Thatcherite isn't, I don't think, that useful for us. When it comes to liberty, I think a lot more can be done. And when it comes to attitudes, I think that Britain is, I'd actually say that the Labour years have had more impact than the lady would have liked to imagine.
I find the notion of her being a conviction politician quite difficult, except for the fact that she's very good at presenting herself in fairly authentic terms. And I think that's what's interesting about her, and I think that Blair in some ways took politics away from that. Blair kind of brought the sort of the branding, and that's what I think people want some return to. I mean, politics in the 80s was authentic because there was Thatcher and you reacted to her in one way or another.
The key kind of inheritance I think we've taken from Thatcher's ideas there is the idea of the public sector crowding out the private sector, which was the key animating idea that she had and that Keith Joseph had and Alan Walters did as well, which was that if the man in Whitehall simply took his jackboot off the neck of the man in the private sector, somehow the private sector would be able to grow and fill the space that was left behind by the public sector being hacked back. And that's always struck me as a really odd model of how any economy works.
What I would argue is that in a post-ideological age, no conviction politician can prevail or succeed. And why do I describe our society as so post-ideological? It's because it's much more heterogeneous. Its values are far more pluralistic. It's more equal in terms of rights-based and unequal in terms of wealth and income. It's fragmented, there's very little social glue, highly individualistic, yet it's so collaborative.
I do think David Cameron modernised and carried on the finest traditions of Thatcher in the welfare reform and the school reform and a little bit to the health reform. He deserves, I think, credit for that. He wouldn't want to take. He's got the right language. She just kept fighting enemies even when there weren't any left. That's why she had to go. And it's true. I mean, she's like, come on, who's next? And it's like, nobody, Margaret. They've all gone. And, oh, come on, you know. But David Cameron is picking up her unfinished business. But I do have a horrible feeling that we are going to have to get to an IMF-style bailout disaster before the need for radicalism is accepted by both political parties.
YouGov conference today has been fantastic. It always is. the star of the conference is always Peter Kellner. He always manages to pull out new polling on new subjects, absolutely relevant to what we're all thinking about. So his polling on how Thatcherite we are now, how much Thatcher really moved the spirit of the nation, was fascinating. Strongly in some ways and not in others. People now believe that private companies making profits is a good thing for the country, but they no longer believe the right to buy is a good thing, which surprised me.
A few years ago, there was a great debate between the doctors, lawyers and economists, all great professions, about which was the oldest profession. They don't get out much, they didn't realize that. And the first group, the doctors, argued that they were clearly the oldest profession because in the first chapter of Genesis, God took a rib from man and made woman, and this was clearly a surgical procedure, and clearly the doctors were therefore the oldest profession. But the lawyers then said, no, 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 because in the first verse of the first chapter of Genesis, God makes order out of chaos, and that is the role of the law, to make order out of chaos. And the economists came along and said, aha, but who created the chaos?
Today was an amazing day, quite extraordinary day. Some of you may have missed it, so I'll quickly fill you in because that's where I was. You know, I mean, after all this sort of banging about and, you know, oh, outrageous and this, that and the other, not big enough, you know, and more army, more air force, come on. In truth, it was a very mellow affair. I was out on the streets talking to people. It was a wonderfully British event. I didn't come here to talk about Thatcher. I came here to bury her, not to praise her. And indeed, I never thought at any time I ever would, because the funny thing I found really was that when she died, I thought, my documentary will fly, but not today. They said it would take 2 weeks before they could, with any dignity, put it out. But as each day passed, my cellars of memory, my memory cellars, began to regurgitate dreadful things. And I began to get a little bit angry. And so I've hosed it all down. And today was a day of charm and remembrance. It was really good.